Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals. Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals.
Hey you guys, welcome to Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal studies scholar about a piece of their work. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan and I do like knowing animals. Now, as always, this episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by ASA. ASA is the Australasian Animal Studies Association. ASA is a fantastic organisation that does a lot of good work to promote animal studies in Australia and around the world. And in actual fact, this episode is coming to you from ASA's biannual conference, which is being held this year in Adelaide at the University of Adelaide. So, yes, as I've just mentioned, we are in Adelaide. It's a beautiful sunny day. Tomorrow, the conference starts off proper, but I'm very, very lucky to be able to have a chat with one of the keynote speakers, one of our international keynote speakers today. So I'm joined by Professor James Serpell. James is a Marie A. Morey Professor of Ethics and Animal Welfare. Did I get all that right?
Marie Moore.
Marie
yes.
Moore. At the University of Pennsylvania School of Veterinary Medicine. He's also director of the Centre for Interaction of Animals and Society. Is that right?
That's right, yes.
Yeah. So James will be very well known to many listeners. He's been writing on animal issues for many, many years. And today we're going to be discussing the second edition of his book, The Domestic Dog, which I have with me right by my side. The first edition was written about 20 years ago and it's just been updated. It's published by Cambridge University Press. Welcome to the podcast, James.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
James, can you start by telling us why you wrote this book or undertook the project of co-editing this book, or editing this book, I should say?
Yes, well, actually, the first edition came about as a result of another conference, a conference I organized in Cambridge, like you said, about 20 years ago, for people interested in dogs and dog behavior. And that then turned into the first edition. And it was rather a scholarly book. It was quite dry, but surprisingly, it sold very well. And it attracted quite a large audience, and it seemed to be timed to coincide with what you might call the professionalization of dog science, maybe. Anyway, it seemed to be a prelude to people suddenly becoming very interested in dogs and dog behavior and dog cognition and things like that, and which was very gratifying. But then about 10 years ago, Cambridge University Press said, hey, how about revising it? And I said, oh, no, I haven't got time for that. And then about 15 years ago, they tried me again, and I sort of wavered, and I sent out letters to the previous contributors and said, what did they think? And unfortunately, they all said, yes, let's do it. So I then started the process, and it's been a very long process, believe me. Because I had to commission 7 new chapters to cover all sorts of things that didn't even exist back in 20 years ago. So it's a major revision. And of course, getting people to finish their chapters was quite an undertaking as well. But anyway, here it is. It's finally seen the light of day, and I'm delighted with it.
Yes, wonderful. Yes, no, I feel your pain. It is very tricky when you're editing a collection. So one of the interesting themes of the book, certainly one that you deal with at length in the introduction and also in the conclusion, is how things have changed. And one of your observations in the introduction of the original edition was that domestic dogs weren't kind of treated in a scholarly way. They were seen as a kind of a side issue. Why do you think attitudes towards domestic dogs have changed in the last 20 years?
That's a really good question, and I don't know. I mean, when I wrote the first edition, it was very clear that people regarded the study of dogs as kind of very low down the priority list, because at that time people were very interested in things like sort of studying wolves and wild animals, which were considered authentic, whereas the dog was generally perceived as a kind of a corrupted wolf, something that had been debased by domestication. And now that's completely turned around, and now people actually are looking at these domestic animals as being incredibly interesting as models for the evolution, for example, of human cognition. So the dog, there are now umpteen research groups around the world studying dog cognition, as they put it, as a model for how maybe human cognitive abilities evolved. And because the dog lives with humans, it's had to, as it were, evolve the same or similar kind of cognitive abilities. So this sort of thing's happened. There's been huge advances, for example, in the study of dog genetics and the behavioral genetics of dogs. And again, people are using animals like dogs as models for maybe how behavior is affected by genes and that sort of thing in humans. So I think people have suddenly got to the notion that because dogs live with us, because they've kind of crossed this divide and between the sort of non-human animal world and the human animal world, that they offer special lessons or special opportunities and insights that didn't exist before.
So is one of the things coming through in what you were just observing that our interest in dogs is perhaps related to our interest in ourselves?
Yes, well, unfortunately, humans are very anthropocentric in that sense, so we tend to always think about what's in it for us. Having said that, it's clear that our relationships with dogs are pretty unique in terms of our relationships with other animals. I can't think of any other animal that exists quite as close to us in every sense of the word, sort of emotionally and physically, as the dog. And that tells us something about the nature of dogs, and it also tells us something about the nature of humans.
Yes, so you observe in your book that some animals have the capacity to become quasi-humans or to obtain a quasi-human status, and really dogs are the exemplar of that. Can you explain to listeners what you mean by a quasi-human status?
Yeah, I mean personhood. So normally, well, actually it's not normal, but traditionally in the sort of Western worldview, there's humans and there's everything else, all the other animals, and there's a sort of categorical division between them. But with some animals, we've sort of allowed them to cross that barrier. And the dog is the one that's crossed that barrier most effectively. And it now lives in this interesting domain somewhere between human and animal. So it's a bit of both. And that's a very unique kind of position to be in, and that's why I refer to them as being quasi-human.
And is that an advantageous position to be in, do you think?
In some respects. So, for example, in many Western households, dogs receive the kind of treatment that most other animals don't get. So they're well looked after, they're cared for very well, they're taken to the veterinarian when they become ill and all these things. But it also, strangely enough, can have negative consequences because dogs aren't humans, clearly, and some aspects of their behavior is actually perceived by humans in very negative terms. So things like promiscuity, incest, eating human waste, all these things that dogs do under certain circumstances are perceived in highly negative terms by humans. So their closeness can result in good treatment, but on the other hand, that closeness can also mean that sometimes they're perceived as being kind of despicable humans. In other words, humans living at a level that humans shouldn't live. And so it's a kind of very ambivalent sort of attitude that people have towards dogs.
Yes, one of the themes in the sections that you contribute to the book, in addition to editing it, has to do with our highly inconsistent attitudes towards dogs. Can you say something about where you see those inconsistencies or where else you see those inconsistencies being expressed?
Yeah. Well, you can see it, for example, in many parts of the world where, especially Southern Asia, where most of the major religions perceive the dog to be an unclean animal. And the reason it's perceived to be unclean is because dogs live kind of on the margins of society in those areas, or tend to live in the margins. And in adapting to living on the margins, they engage in behavior that, as I said, humans perceive as being kind of depraved or almost sinful, But it's only perceived as depraved or sinful because dogs are somehow considered to be close to humans. So again, there's this strange ambivalence. In our own culture, it most often comes out in relation to dog attacks, dog bites, where, we've allowed dogs sort of, as it were, into our homes, into our lives as family members, as quasi-persons. And that's fine as long as they refrain from engaging in some of the behavior that defines them as animals, like unprovoked aggression or something like that. And when dogs actually do lash out and bite people, then you get sometimes very severe backlash, and you get things like breed bans and breed-specific legislation, very, very draconian laws to prevent the ownership or restrict the ownership of certain dog breeds based on the actions of a very small minority of dogs. And that seems to me, again, a manifestation of this sort of ambivalence, so that we really love dogs and we enjoy their company, but only if they refrain from behaving like dogs, if you see what I mean.
Yes, I do. Yes, we've had quite a few issues with dangerous dog or breed exclusion legislation for particular types of dogs. Do you have a view on whether it's an effective approach to managing aggression?
Well, the evidence suggests that it is ineffective, completely ineffective, for a number of reasons. One reason being that it's almost impossible to identify most of these breeds reliably. And there have been studies where that have actually followed up on reports of dog attacks where a particular breed, such as the pit bull, has been initially claimed to have been the breed responsible. But then people have done follow-up on those and found out that, in fact, they weren't. It was an indeterminate mongrel dog that was responsible, but the person just kind of assumed it was a pit bull because it bit them. And so there's a lot of that. That's a problem. Genetically, you can't really distinguish them effectively either. And to me, the biggest problem is that if you actually look at the data, it is a very small percentage of the total breed that is responsible. So often it's like a few percent of the breed are responsible for all of these problems. And that means that 90% of the breed is perfectly all right. And so you're unfairly discriminating against the majority based on the behavior of a few bad apples. And so from that point of view, it doesn't make sense either. And also where they've implemented these breed bans or breed-specific legislation, they don't see a recognizable decrease in the number of dog bites. So generally, I would say all the evidence points to them being a waste of time and also being grossly unfair, really.
Mm-hmm. So one of the things you observe in your book is that the science has changed over the last 20 years. Some things are being considered in a way that they hadn't been considered at all, and some things that were thought to be settled kind of facts are now being reviewed. Thinking about perhaps a third edition in 20 years' time, where do you think the science might go? Or do you know what's the contested territory that you wouldn't be surprised that gets revised in the future?
That's a really interesting question. I mean, I was actually, looking back in retrospect, I was quite surprised by the areas that expanded between the two editions of this book. So trying to predict where things might go next is a bit hard to say. I think clearly at some point they're going to achieve some sort of clarity about the origins of the domestic dog. At the moment, that's completely up in the air. There's a lot of molecular genetic work going on to try and trace where dogs came from. Most of the work has been done on living dog populations, but recently these molecular archaeologists have started to look at extinct dogs. They're getting DNA from extinct dogs and wolves. And that hopefully will clarify where on earth dogs came from, because it's a real mess at the moment. There are competing claims from Southeast Asia, from Northern Asia, from Europe, and Central Asia, and it's really unclear at this point where on earth the dog came from, whether it was a single domestication that then spread, or whether there were multiple episodes of domestication early on. The timing is also a little uncertain. There are some people claiming quite early, sort of 30,000 years ago, which is very early. Other people saying it's more like 15,000 years ago, and a few people are saying, oh no, that's all a mistake. It didn't happen until the Neolithic, which is about 10,000 years ago. So a lot of uncertainty there. In fact, more uncertainty now than there was 20 years ago when I did the first edition. Behavioral genetics, a lot of work to be done there, with new techniques in genetics that you can do these genome-wide association studies that hopefully will be able to find areas of the genome associated with particular behavioral characteristics or temperament characteristics. What else? I think there's going to be a lot more work on free-roaming dogs and the behavior of free-roaming dogs and the ecology of free-roaming dogs, often in relation to population management issues. It's really hard to predict all the directions this could go.
Well, we'll have to regroup in 20 years' time and revise your proposals.
Sounds like a plan.
So, James, I ask everyone who comes on Knowing Animals to answer 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
Alrighty.
Okay. Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
Yes, it was a book by a woman called Ruth Harrison called Animal Machines, which I read when I was really quite young. And was very affected by it, kind of opened my eyes to things I hadn't been aware of before.
Wonderful. Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
Well, the sort of major piece was a book called In the Company of Animals, which I wrote in 1986. And that was really it started off as a book about why people keep pets, but it kind of evolved into a much more complicated story about why people were able to have such paradoxical attitudes and relationships with animals. And I sort of started off the book by contrasting the way we treat pigs with the way we treat pets, animals like dogs and cats, and kind of developed it from there. It became a kind of, I delved into history and psychology and a little bit of everything. It was a very kind of superficial, but also for me at the time, it was it was an exploration of a topic that had interested me for a long time, but I just, actually I was unemployed at the time, so I could devote myself to this job.
Wonderful. If you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
I guess probably Peter Singer would have to, be a major figure. I mean, Animal Liberation was one of those landmark books that really got people thinking about the whole issue of animal sentience and the importance of animals' interests, and really did an excellent job of sort of highlighting the inconsistencies in the way we treat animals.
Popular choice, I have to say, yes. I mean, Peter Singer's obviously had a very big impact on animal studies. What's the most important thing academics can do for animals?
Well, I think I have a certain apprehension about getting too involved in activism, because I regard my field as being one of scholarship and trying to research these issues and study them and look at the evidence and be very careful about it, but also publish it and make it accessible and available to people. Nevertheless, I respect academics who do get involved in activism. I don't much. I kind of stay on the sidelines, but I write stuff, and I see people use the stuff I write to try and bring about change, and I'm all in favor of that. But I'm a little bit ambivalent about whether or not I, as an academic, want to get involved in that, because I feel as though once I commit to that, then it might affect my objectivity in some way. So I have to say I'm a little ambivalent about it.
Absolutely. Perfectly fine answer. I mean, some people say things like creating a space in the classroom where you can think about animal issues. But I guess for someone who's a veterinarian, people are thinking about animal issues the whole time, aren't they?
Well, they do and they don't. But veterinarians are, again, also play a very ambiguous role, because, yes, while they're treating people's pets and acknowledging this human-animal attachment and bond, they're also treating livestock and dealing with clients who are farmers or lab animal researchers and things like that. So they play both sides of this, and that's an awkward situation to be in, actually. I teach ethics to veterinarians and have to address all these animal issues, and every year I get complaints from some of the students, because if I side too much with the large animal vets, the small animal students object to me, and if I side too much with them, the large animal students object to what I have to say. So it's a very difficult role to play.
Final question. If you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
I think it's, humans, sadly, I don't think humans are ever going to stop using animals for their own purposes. But I think we need to, people need to learn to be honest about it, instead of just sort of burying their heads in the sands and denying that there's a problem. There's clearly a problem with the way we treat animals, there's no question, in almost every sphere you look at. Companion animals, food animals, lab animals, it doesn't matter. There are many, many problems from the perspective of the welfare of those animals, and people need to acknowledge that and do what they can to improve things. It's not necessarily going to be cheap. It will cost people will have to pay more for the things they derive from animals, but I think that's money well spent, because really just being in this constant state of denial about what we do to animals is not healthy for us or for them.
So James, what are you working on next?
Well, I'm working on about 1 million different projects at the same time, so I do a lot of collaboration with other people. My current project, which I'm working on sort of in the little bit of time I have to myself, is a reanalysis of the whole story of dog domestication and how it happened, because I feel like the current story that's prevalent is very, very misleading.
Right. Fabulous. So how can people find out more about your work?
I don't know. They can go they can go online to ResearchGate, and you can see a lot of my publications there. By all means, buy the book, The Domestic Dog.
Yes.
Where else could they go? I don't know.
Your university webpage?
Yeah, there's a little information on the university webpage. Just Google me. You'll find lots of stuff on there.
Well, James, thank you very much for joining us on Knowing Animals, and thank you to the listeners for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter at knowing_animals, or you can follow me at SO_S. Also, don't forget to subscribe to us on iTunes and to review us on iTunes. As you know, iTunes are all powerful. Your reviews and your subscriptions help other people find the podcast. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan, and I do like knowing animals.